All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I am Liz Harris. I work for BikeWalkKC. I'm the marketing and events coordinator here. And I want to thank you all for coming to this Let's Talk Visualizing Impact with mySidewalk. We're excited to talk about this with you today. Just a couple of notes. This session is being recorded, and we will have that available for you after the session today. We'll send out a follow-up email tomorrow that will include the link to this recording, as well as any other links that we need to follow up with afterwards. You're all muted for right now, and we're going to keep you muted until after the presentation. And then we will open up the chat box. So the chat box will be open this whole time. Please feel free to introduce yourselves, ask questions as we go along. We'll collect those as well as the questions you submitted when you registered for this event. And we'll talk about those towards the end. We've reserved some time today to go over some questions. I want to thank our BikeWalkKC members and sponsors for making this possible today. We, as a nonprofit, member-supported organization, we appreciate each and every person who gives of their time and their resources to support safer streets and more connected communities with BikeWalkKC. I am going to turn it over to Eric Rogers, our executive director. A couple of words about this virtual series. The pandemic is accelerating a lot of trends and making big changes that were already in progress. And 6 months into it, we are seeing that in a big way. Our Let's Talk series is a conversation with leaders in Kansas City to find out how that acceleration is happening locally for transportation, health, equity, and sustainability issues that are core to our mission, as well as intersectional issues that often overlap, issues such as racism, housing, economic development, and more. I think that this dashboard today is going to really demonstrate how a lot of those things are truly connected for all of us. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our executive director, Eric Rogers, who will lead us into this.
Thank you, Liz, and welcome everybody. It's nice to see a lot of familiar faces and new faces as well. For those of you here today who have any experience with nonprofits or even other realms of the public sector, you probably know that measuring outcomes and impacts is a big challenge for a lot of the work we do. And for us at BikeWalkKC and those others working in the active living and active transportation spaces, we often have the twin challenge, not only of measuring the outcomes of our own work, but also the outcomes of the work we're advocating for that are really the responsibility of public agencies and local governments. America's been spending 50 years intentionally designing our communities in a way that makes it hard and unsafe and uncomfortable to live active lifestyles. Kansas City more so than most places in the country. And so it's going to be a long, hard process to change that. And that's something that can be hard to measure, how we're doing and how we're succeeding. So the dashboard that we're going to show you all today is one of our strategies to address those challenges. To measure our own work in terms of our programs and our activities and our services, but then also how we are trying to hold policymakers and decision makers accountable for the policies that are going to help improve our built environment. So it's built on you'll see a really interesting foundation of data from a lot of sources. And that allows us to do a few things. One, we can look for and highlight disparities so that we can be informed about how best to center equity in our work going forward. Provides evidence bases for decision-making about what policy goals we would pursue. And we hope it'll give community members and colleagues a new source of data, data that's often hard to find and access and use. So I wanted say thank you to the Health Forward Foundation, who provided us with the resources to make this project possible and to work with our partner in this project, mySidewalk. You don't know about mySidewalk, I'm going to turn it over to Josh Bain here now and have him tell you a little bit about the company and what they do, and then start showing us all this dashboard. So Josh, please take it away.
Yeah, hi everyone. Great to meet some of you, and good to see a lot of you that I know. My name is Josh Bain. I'm a solutions architect with mySidewalk. mySidewalk is a company that at its core is a software company, but we believe our mission is to democratize data science for organizations that otherwise wouldn't have access to kind of the robust tools that large, private, powerful corporations and other entities have access to. So our goal is to provide this type of data visualization, data analysis tool to folks who are either in the public sector or are working for nonprofit or public impact type roles. And so we've known about BikeWalkKC for a long time. I've been a member for a long time and have been watching their progress throughout the region. And it was so exciting to be able to partner with them through the development of this dashboard. They had a lot of really great ideas partly underway in their data collection work. They're, I'm sure you've seen their annual reports and the work that they report out on every year. So, there's a lot of that tangible kind of instantaneous data that's quantifying their impact on a annual, monthly, quarterly basis. But then there's some new stuff in here too. Some really great data from their bike share and micromobility system. There's some really interesting stuff from the U.S. Census. We've taken a look at infrastructure data. So when we started this, I think we kind of laid everything out on the table, and we started kind of wading through the sea of data that was available to us. And one of the things that we say at mySidewalk is that data is not intelligence. That intelligence, is a narrowed, curated, clean view of data. And so that process takes some time, and it also takes dialogue. It takes listening to other people who maybe weren't involved at the get-go in formulating the data project. So this is the result of a couple of rounds of revisions from people who were able to review this. But my hope, honestly, is that you would see this, you'd react to it, and that you'd be able to provide us with a little bit of feedback. You might notice, maybe I've drawn a bike lane that wasn't in the right place. And if you've got that feedback, there's a place for you to provide that feedback right in this dashboard. But we're really looking forward to this discussion today about the data that we're going to share you, and our hope is that this is a starting point, and that it will continue to grow and evolve over our relationship. So that's the mySidewalk intro and plug. I think now we'll probably walk you through different elements of the dashboard. But before I do that, I think it might be helpful if I share the link. This is to the dashboard itself so that you can click through on your own. I'll do a screen share now, but I want to make sure that people who are interested can click through as needed. So if you follow the link, you'll go to dashboards.mysidewalk.com/BikeWalkKC organizational impact. This is the landing page. You'll notice that you're not overwhelmed with data. It's not data right at first. It's narrative. It's talking about BikeWalkKC's mission. And with that, I thought, maybe it would be good to have Eric start off. He's going to explain the education and programming section, which really speaks to a lot of the direct impact measures that BikeWalkKC has been collecting for years now about the type of work they're doing in the community.
Thank you, Josh. So for those that aren't as familiar with our organization, we do a lot of advocacy and public policy work. Often, at Upstream, a lot of work on the upstream social determinants of health, but our education programs are also at the same time often the ones where we're most directly serving individuals in the community. So we operate what we think is one of the largest safe routes to school programs in the country, across dozens of schools every year. Before the pandemic shut schools down, we were closing in on having served 30,000 kids in under 10 years. And we primarily do that work in the urban core and the first ring suburbs in Kansas City. And so that includes things like youth bike safety education, walking school buses, youth development programs for high school students, and then technical assistance for schools and school professionals. So this is a way to now start quantifying a lot of that work, talk about what we're doing, where we're doing it. If you want to go down a little bit further, Josh. This system has allowed us to start mapping a lot of this work. So these are individual sites where we're delivering Safe Routes to School programming, and the size of the dot indicates the number of kids that we've worked with at that school. The white outlines there are the school districts themselves. And then we have, one of the cool things about this dashboard is in these charts and graphs, you can often tab left and right and get more information. So this is an overlay of the blue dots are the schools, and then the pink shading are households that have no access to vehicles, which in a lot of the urban core in Kansas City, there are census tracts where it's 50% or more of households don't have access to a vehicle. So this allows us to look and see, are we aligning our activity with the areas of greatest need for transportation options. And, you know, as Josh pages through these maps, any of you that work in healthy eating, active living have seen all of the maps of food deserts and disparities in health outcomes and access to prosperity. And those maps are largely the same, and they're largely the same maps that we look at in terms of transportation disparities. And so this allows us to really see how the work we're doing aligns with the need in the community, and then also intersects with other important issues in the community. Okay, Josh, what else do we have on this page?
Yeah, that's the extent of the
Okay.
program data that we're visualizing. What you'll see in a lot of this is that you know, we're introducing and framing the topic. There's a wealth of data that BikeWalkKC has access to and has been collecting over time. You'll notice there's time series data showing kind of the growth of their impact over time. 2020 looks lower because it's a partially complete school year, and obviously the pandemic has complicated some things. But throughout all of this, you should be able to download the underlying data if that's of interest to you. You could also download images of the maps that you see. So if you've you know, would like to use some of this underlying data for the work that you're doing, for the advocacy mission that you have, you're free to do that for anything that's shown here. Again, just a handful of sample visualizations of BikeWalkKC's impact. We've aggregated everything to the school building level, so nothing personally identifiable or identifiable to a student, but enough that would show you, you know, kind of the overall scheme and breadth of their impact throughout the region. I was pretty amazed when I first looked at all the building sites where they had a program or have a program, and the diversity of their programming is pretty expansive too. So our goal is not to reinvent the wheel of the database that they've curated and created, but instead to just you know, show a high level impact of their work there. On the access and equity section, you know, I think Eric mentioned this in the introduction, but, you know, Kansas City, like most of the US, is a region that was built for automobile access, and that has a lot of different implications when you look at it from an intersectional perspective. If you look through a race lens or a class lens or, you know, an ability lens, that, you know, people have different levels of access to opportunity in a region if you have a car or don't have a car. And so this section really is trying to be a deep dive into that particular topic and how it impacts our region as a whole. And it's meant to frame the conversation around infrastructure and the shared mobility system that BikeWalkKC has built, and why safety matters. Again, that's a part of the dashboard that's coming soon. But yeah, we definitely wanted to frame all of that, starting with the idea of households that don't have access to a car. So I personally don't own a vehicle, but I'm in a one-car household. My partner has a vehicle, and that has expanded my mobility options significantly. So I have that level of privilege, and I, as a result, don't have problems accessing healthcare, accessing healthy food, and I live in a relatively safe, an area where it's relatively safe to walk and bike, and I have a multitude of transportation options and choices. I'm also able to work from home, but all of these, not everyone is that lucky, and so this dashboard is an attempt to kind of communicate how that is different throughout different people's lived experiences in the region. So in the Kansas City area, some basic facts to start with. About 6% of households in the region are zero vehicle households. That total, it doesn't sound like 6% is a small minority, but that's 50,000 individual households that don't have a car, and as a result aren't able to fully participate in the Kansas City economy and Kansas City society because we've designed it in a way that requires automobile access. You can see the breakdown here of Kansas City and how it compares to the US on average. And I think this probably matches your intuition that the US has a greater share of zero vehicle households, and Kansas City has a lower share of that. As you start to look into geospatial data, this might have a little bit more meaning to you, but you can see visualized here at the census tract level the number of, or the percentage of zero vehicle households in each area. And then if you click on the individual census tracts, you'll notice that you'll have the value for the tract, but then you'll also get the value for the city that census tract lies in. So, in Kansas City, Missouri, 10% of households overall don't have access to a vehicle. And that's different from Roland Park, Kansas, where the value is closer to 3%. So you can explore that here. You'll also be able to export the data. You can export this as a table if you'd like. And so if you wanted to create your own ranking of zero car households in the region, you could certainly do that. We looked at the issue of race, and that was actually a kind of a surprisingly complicated question because the census measures race at the person level and vehicle access at the household level. And so it required looking at some microdata, and these aren't readily available summary statistics. So the folks at the University of Minnesota Population Center have created a really helpful microdata tool that I use to generate these numbers. But if you look at the regional average for individuals of all races, you can see that it's just under 4%, and that white folks have the greatest access to automobiles, and that Black people have the highest share of zero vehicle households. And you can see the racial breakdown here. And these are individuals that live in a household with zero vehicles. If you just did a pure ratio from Black to white, that's 3.8 times. You're 3.8 times more likely to live in a zero car household if you're Black. If you look at it from an income perspective, there's a pretty striking gap as well. And I'm pausing for a second because, you'll notice that there's a pretty big jump between one vehicle household, the median income of a one vehicle household and a two vehicle household. And that's oftentimes because, one vehicle household might be a single person household, and a two vehicle household might have a two worker household. Their incomes are going to be a little bit higher. But you can see that, for the most part, people without vehicles are lower income folks as well. So some basic facts to start with. We're not providing a ton of commentary on what that means, but for me, it means that if you don't have access to a vehicle, that's highly associated with being lower income, also being a person of color. And so, we've designed a transportation system that is designed for those types of privilege. When you look at the question of transit and jobs access, again, kind of a similar challenge in tabulating some of the data. We had to look at census microdata in order to come up with that, these values, but you can see sort of the breakdown by mode share. These are all of the non-automobile mode shares broken down. So work from home, obviously this is based on a 5-year average, so it's not representing current work from home situations. You can tell, working from home. And then you can see walking, biking, and transit use by race as well, where the data was available. And I think you know, I'm probably a little bit over time on this section and don't want to belabor the point too much, but I did want to point out that as we think about jobs access as a region and participating in the economy, that you know, it's helpful to think of non-car modes as complements to one another rather than as substitutes for one another. So here's a map looking at sort of a walking distance of the pre-COVID bus stops within the region. And these are all transit routes. You know, if they have 3 runs a day, that's different from a, you know, transit route that has 100 runs a day, but they're all visualized here, and you can kind of see a half-mile walking distance. That's for an able-bodied person, a 10-minute walk. When you expand that out a little bit more, and I guess I should say that sums up to about 580,000 jobs that are within access of a half-mile distance from a bus stop, compared to nearly 1 million jobs in the region. And when you look at, you know, if you were to think about a biking distance, so somebody who puts a bike on a bus and can maybe go 2 miles in the same time, then that number expands pretty significantly, and you can see how that radius expands. So as I think about BikeWalkKC's mission, again, an outsider not necessarily speaking for them, but I think of it as connected to a total system of transportation alternatives. And you know, we'll talk about this later, but all of this, you know, being able to have interoperable complementary transit systems, all that depends on having infrastructure where people feel safe riding a bike or feel safe walking, and where there are appropriate sidewalks and ADA facilities. And then really quick too, I just wanted to point out, there's a map kind of showing where people with disabilities in the region live. I, you know, remember in college, I was a personal care attendant for the whole person for my college roommate, and a big part of my job was driving my roommate from place to place. And you know, while he could navigate campus at UMKC fairly well, it was really difficult for him to get to his social work practicums, and that required me driving him a pretty far distance. And so, you know, I thought it was important to visualize this data as well. And again, I hope that you're able to draw some meaningful conclusions about access from the data that you see here. And I think next we're going to look at mobility trends, and this is my section, but I'm going to go pretty quickly through it. You know, a lot of times in transportation planning, we're focused on the commute trip as sort of the underlying most important trip. And one of the things that this pandemic has taught me is that that's actually not the case, that people use transportation systems for a whole bunch of other reasons. We're leveraging here a piece of survey data from the National Household Travel Survey that asks people, and this is from 2017, but it asks a statistically significant sample of people, you know, how they get around, where they're going, what the purpose of their trip is, how long their trips are, so that we can generalize that to a larger population. And you can actually do that for sub areas within the country as well. We've done it for the Kansas City, Missouri region here. But when you look at trip purposes, either going to or from work, you find that that only amounts to about 19% of trips in the Kansas City area. Consistent with the United States, about 1 in 5 trips are either to or from work. Yet we pile on so much planning and analysis work around getting to and from a job. And so I think there's a big disconnect in our transportation planning practice, and then what data says people need transportation resources for. Obviously, getting to a job is core and fundamental to why we plan for transportation systems, but I think it's interesting to think about other non-work purposes for the trips, whether it be shopping and errands, social or recreational trips, meals, transporting other people. You can see that the trip purpose is broken down here by percentage of overall trips. And then you can see at a national level for people who walk, people who bike, and then for all trips in general, the trip purpose breakdown. So, you know, people are often biking for social or recreational purposes at higher rates than they are for shopping and errands, for example. And you can see the breakdown for all of those trip purposes here, and use that in your planning work and your advocacy work as well. And then finally, I think it's important too to think about, you know, because we're so focused on mode share shift and trying to get people away from single occupancy vehicle commutes, I think it's important to think about all of the non-commute trips that we can move the needle on to. The average commute trip in Kansas City is I think it's close to 10 miles. So that's you know, a long bike commute. But the other trip purposes are actually much shorter than that. And so if you think about trips that are within within biking distance, about 2 miles, let's say, is a reasonable biking distance, or trips that are within a walking distance, you find that about 8% of trips in the region are within walking distance, and about 36% of trips are within biking distance. So imagine, so that's like the share of the total pie that we could really start chipping away at realistically, as we talk about mode share shift and helping to, you know, change the system where people get around the region. That's not going to necessarily show up in the annual ACS commute rankings, but it's a really great way to think about moving, you know, switching out these shorter trips under 3 miles, under 2 miles, to a different type of commuting. And then one last page, and I'll be quiet because you can explore this at your leisure. But we did look at where Kansas City ranks when it comes to single occupancy vehicle commutes. So we're 47th out of 50 of the 50 largest metros there. And then you can kind of see the breakdown of where people aren't driving alone throughout the region, as well as a table that ranks every place, every census designated place, municipality within the region. And we've done the same thing for walk commuters and bike commuters. So it's you know, this is a very long chart, obviously, but it's interesting to see that Kansas City kind of falls somewhere between Dallas and San Antonio. You can see that St. Louis across the state falls somewhere between Raleigh and Louisville. And so it's a fun way for me, anyway, of understanding where Kansas City lies in terms of alternative commutes. And I'll be interested to see how this changes over time as well. So with that, I think it's Thomas's turn to talk a little bit about the bike share and shared mobility network that BikeWalkKC operates.
Thanks, Josh. So, you know, one of the things that BikeWalkKC does is sort of operate and plan for, you know, the existing operations and future expansion of the regional bike share system. And bike share is a service that is also in a lot of flux in terms of changing technologies, in terms of changing vendors and providers. And it's something that relates directly to our mission of supporting people's access to alternative transportation modes. And so there's some data in here we have from our bike share program that shows how well we're doing that, or how that access is improving over time. But what's interesting about the bike share data is that it provides a pretty unique insight into broader trends in terms of biking. So anyone who works in the transportation area knows that lack of data is one of the critical challenges with planning for bike infrastructure, bicycle mobility planning. There's just not a lot of data about where people are biking. And a lot of decisions about where people bike are based on conditions of infrastructure and destinations that are always changing. So what's interesting about this bike share data is that we can begin to use this subset of data we have about where and how people are using bike share and extrapolate from there to begin to make some inferences about the broader state of biking in the region. And it's not a perfect data source, but it's a data source in a field that is very short on data about these sorts of topics. So in this first graph here, you can sort of see the growth of our bike share system over time in terms of the number of rides, and you can begin to see how the system was supplemented with starting with kiosk-based bike rentals, and then expanding into more lock-to, free-floating e-bikes and scooters and other opportunities. And you can see the gradual growth of the system over time. If you can go to the next one, Josh. You can also see the growth in ridership, right? So, you know, questions about, you know, as we look at new technologies and new opportunities, is it the same riders who are just using new tools, or are we reaching new types of people, making new types of trips? So it's nice to be able to at a glance to be able to see how the use is changing over time, and to look at what are the trends in those different modes. So this is a graph that sort of shows that as e-bike use continues to grow, what is the relationship between that and our conventional kiosk-based system over time? If you can scroll down a little bit, Josh. The other thing that's really interesting, we have data about the trips and rentals and where people are starting their trip and ending their trip. We have millions of GPS points about where our trips are, but before this dashboard, we didn't have a lot of tools to synthesize that data. So this sort of color chart here of where rides are happening when is an example of how visualizing this data lets us understand what's happening in a new way. So if you look at the traditional bikes in that first chart there, you see that there's a very heavy use on the weekends, in the afternoons. There's sort of an implication here that this is a high recreational use for these types of bikes. But if we scroll to how the e-bikes are being used, now we see these bars showing up at commute times. So 7 or 8 in the morning, 5 in the evening. We're also seeing use during the week, much throughout the day. So now with this visualization, we can begin to understand that the types of trips people are taking, where they're going, how much they're using the system is changing based on the type of technology that we're providing. And if we can go, yeah, and then we can see as our system expands, as our transportation to options expand, what does that do in terms of total growth? So if you click through this, Josh, you can sort of see 2015, 2016, we're able to see through where people are using bike share that people are making more trips in more places or reaching more of the region, providing access to more residents who can benefit from alternative transportation options. If we go up into the heat map here, so in addition to data about trips and how long they are and where they begin and end, we have GPS data from across the region about where people are riding. So I mentioned this before. This is, for me as a community planner, this is extremely valuable data that doesn't really exist in any other form. I can look at this map and see, based on the existing infrastructure in a community, where are people biking today? Do they have a preference for one route or another? Are there clear barriers or separations in the network that are preventing bike use from getting one place to another? And because we can look at this data over time, we can begin to see the impact of infrastructure decisions on actual use. So we know how many people are making bike share trips, and while we don't have on the ground observations of every street in the region, we can make some reasonable assumptions about how many bike trips are bike share trips. And with that data, we can begin to make some inferences about what is the level of biking on different types of streets. So this core problem of data collection for people who are biking. And we're working on, it's sort of a work in progress, but we're working on a way to aggregate these GPS points into street segments so that we can begin to actually measure daily ridership on all of the streets in the region. So I'm pretty excited about this as a tool. I'm excited for other people to begin to take a look at it and begin to see how biking in the region is working in a way that we haven't been able to do before. The last piece of this that I'll say, we have some information on our legacy system, our kiosk-based system that has some useful origin destination type data that even though we're phasing away from the use of kiosks, being able to look at where people travel from where in a very categorical way can also be useful. So Josh, I think we'll go ahead and move on to infrastructure. So when we, Rogers mentioned at the very beginning, Eric Rogers, that one of our challenges as an organization is that the impacts we're trying to achieve are on complex systems with multi-generational inputs and individual programs or efforts that we might employ sort of move the needle a little bit now, or might have an impact years down the road beyond the scope of a specific program that we're offering. And infrastructure definitely falls into that category. And so it's useful for us to think about data in terms of how can we understand this infrastructure to begin to make decisions today that can yield some of those regional systemic outcomes down the road. And so part of the reason one of the things we do when we think about infrastructure is to think about who is out there, riding a bike. And there's a lot of research about the different types of cyclists. And the idea that the majority of people fall into a category where they are interested in riding a bike, but they are concerned about their safety. And that comes directly back to infrastructure, because there's a particular type of environment where that group of people might choose to ride. And if we can provide that type of environment, then we can try to capture some of that potential ridership of people who are interested but aren't riding today. And all of the things that we're trying to achieve, from environmental benefits to employee and service access, to just access to opportunity and mobility choices, all of those community benefits hinge on getting more people to ride. And we want to get more people to ride, we have to capture these people who are interested but not riding today. And that means we have to look at, can we create a network that is safe and comfortable for all ages and abilities? And so BikeWalkKC has for a little while been maintaining a database of regional bike infrastructure that has a lot of information about the network in the region, and has information that's relevant to these questions about safety and comfort. How wide is the facility? Is there some sort of buffer and protection from other uses? That sort of thing. And so you can see here that finally with this tool, we're able to aggregate all of this and look at the 800 plus miles of trails, bike lanes, and facilities in the region. But the other thing we're able to do is look at, frankly, some of the incredible progress that the region has been making over the past 18 months. And so I know many others who work in transportation areas, often we get caught up in the politics or the challenges of individual projects, all the messy details and community engagement challenges of a particular project. But having data about the entire network, we're able to look at, for example, there was 56 new miles of bike infrastructure since 2019. Over the past 18 months, we've seen about a 10% growth in the entire network in the region, which is, that's on pace to, to rapidly expand the network. And by being able to map it, we're able to begin to identify where are there gaps, what are some of the interesting trends. We're also able to look at this data as an advocacy tool to work with different community partners. So we can look at the different policy and infrastructure decisions communities are making, somewhere like Olathe or Lee Summit with a strong emphasis on shared use paths, as a contrast to somewhere like Overland Park that has many miles of striped on-street infrastructure. Contrasting Overland Park, where they're focused on lower traffic arterials, with somewhere like Kansas City, Missouri, where they've really chewed on some of the really challenging, busy streets and providing high quality infrastructure in those places. So we have a map here, but we also have a ranking where we can sort of see how much is there in each of these communities, both the total miles of these different facilities, but also what are, per capita, how are these different places doing, and looking at trails versus bike lanes versus shared paths and other types of infrastructure. And so that's sort of a picture of the state of infrastructure in the region. But the challenge in our work in terms of this infrastructure is also often about the funding. So I'm going to pass it back to Josh to sort of quickly review that.
Sorry, unmuting myself. So really quickly, we looked at a couple of different data sources for this, and I'll just say that I'm really grateful to both of these sources for making their data as publicly as available as they did on infrastructure spending. It's obviously a challenging and squishy data set to maintain because you've got budgeted costs and then you've got actual costs, and those tend to change, and the construction, the realities of construction aren't always easy. And so what you're seeing here is really representative of our interpretation, mySidewalk's interpretation of the Mid-America Regional Council's data that they've made publicly accessible and the City of Kansas City, Missouri's data that they've made publicly accessible. This isn't really their opinion of the data necessarily, but the thing to keep in mind regionally as we think about kind of the larger priority projects is that it's a really big bucket of funding, federal dollars that flow through the region. About $1.7 billion worth of projects have been identified in a 4-year period, what's called the Transportation Improvement Program. You can click on different links here to see the official maps and project listings from the Mid-America Regional Council. These are some summary statistics of that underlying data source that we've taken advantage of here. Here you can see just the total pie chart. So road, bridge, and safety projects are sort of similarly colored because they tend to be on a roadway system. You can see transit projects broken out separately, some transportation management projects, so kind of transportation alternatives or projects that are meant to manage demand. And then you've got the non-motorized bike ped projects as well that are showing up here. More specifically, you can see kind of the federal, state, and local funding breakdown of projects that have even a penny of federal funding attached to them. This isn't going to take into account GO bond projects or PIAC projects that would exist in Kansas City, Missouri, where it's all local funds, but it would be everything that falls within the Mid-America Regional Council's tip. And you can see, obviously, maybe not obviously, but to me, it's obvious that most money in the region from a federal perspective is going to new roadway construction, roadway reconstruction. And then you've got a lot of transit capital spending in the region as well. One note, this outlier here on transit operations is that, of the money that we spend running buses and paratransit and other services, most of that's going to be locally generated, most of it from Kansas City, Missouri. So you can toggle off this information here. Finally, I just wanted to kind of show you the flows between federal, state, and local projects from everything that's on the Transportation Improvement Program. A lot of decisions are, we talk about the Mid-America Regional Council and regional suballocated funds, but some of the decisions about what money gets spent where on which highways isn't necessarily a decision that's, it's not necessarily money that a body at the Mid-America Regional Council is suballocating. They're getting, a fraction of the federal dollars that flow through our region. Some of it, like transit dollars, is going to flow automatically to the Kansas City Area Transportation Authority. Others is, new starts and build grants and that sort of thing doesn't necessarily get suballocated through the region, even though Mark has an incredibly important role to play in helping plan for those investments. And then here you can see kind of a map of all of those transportation improvement projects. They're shaded based on the system that they're on. So bike ped projects are in green, transit in orange, then roadway projects in that hot pink color. And then you can see some of the bigger non-motorized transportation projects that are occurring in the region that were listed on the tip. So that's regional spending. I know we're kind of coming up on our time, so I'm gonna take a really quick pass at spending within Kansas City, Missouri, but because they've got such a rich open data portal, we were able to visualize all of the capital improvements data that Kansas City has been collecting and mapping over a 20-year period. Mostly, I believe, a person by the name of Steve Lebowski, who is kind enough to provide the geospatial data to us. But you can see sort of the in-district versus citywide sales tax money, the PIAC funds that you so often hear about, and then where and how those are being spent within the region. You can see kind of the breakdown of different project types here, as well as for the different we've shown all of the PIAC funding categories by year, and we kind of blued out or grayed out the non-transportation PIAC dollars, so that it really highlights the transportation projects that are occurring year over year. And so we've got that for in-district. And then there are some citywide funds as well that typically go to larger projects, but they're a share of that 1 cent sales tax. And then there's GO bond funding, which we could talk about at length. But the real goal there is to talk about where that's been allocated over the last several years of those bond issuances, what's happening with the sidewalk program, and what types of roadway projects and other transportation projects are being invested in, kind of using those GO bond dollars. So you can see all of that information here. We're kind of running short on time, so I didn't want to belabor this point too much for the group, but it's there, it's a resource for you. And if anyone from the city is listening and has more updated data, happy to work with you on getting that up to date as well.
Yeah, I'm going to go really quick on safety, and just to say we have some data here about safety, and we have more coming soon. You know, I think the Kansas City, Missouri has a resolution focused on Vision Zero, reducing traffic fatalities. The Mid-America Regional Council has a Vision Zero Summit coming up. One of the big challenges with talking about transportation safety is access to quality data about crashes, injuries, deaths, and incidents. Part of our goal moving forward is to connect that safety data to infrastructure and demographic data to begin to find a more targeted way to focus investments and interventions to improve safety. I'm going to send it back to Roger.
Thank you, Thomas. Just real quickly, this last section is talking a little bit about how we try to take something that's really often more qualitative data and talk about it alongside this quantitative data. So we do our advocacy and our public policy work around this policy cycle with these phases of setting the agenda, formulating the policy, getting the policy adopted, implementing the policy, and then over time, maintaining it and evaluating it to see if it needs any extra attention. And so down here, we've started to really, further down the page, a lot of our work right now is around complete streets and Vision Zero policies. And so we've broken out those two at a regional level, and then more specifically in Kansas City, Missouri and Kansas City, Kansas, to kind of visually represent where we are in our work to advocate for these policies along with our partners and stakeholders. Like many things in this dashboard, it's still early. This was a huge project, and so we chose, this is kind of to Matt Kleiman's question in the chat, we started with transportation as the main data set because that's where most of our work is centered. We have some equity data in here as well because we felt that was really important to include early on. We know there are also lots of great data around health out there. The Health Forward Foundation maintains a regional health dashboard that in some ways is very analogous to this. And so in future phases of this project, we hope to be able to pull in other sorts of data, especially health and more equity data. And I guess I'm already into the Q&A. So yeah. Josh, I think you have access to the questions as well. If you see any interesting ones you want to pull out. I'm going to start with one about privacy and ask Josh if you could speak to a little bit about how privacy is handled within this system and some of the data sets that we're using here.
Yeah, and I think it's a good question. So BikeWalkKC has entrusted mySidewalk with some really great data sets that are really powerful, but our priority in this, in visualizing the data and talking about the data, is making sure that it does keep people's personal information private. And so as you look at the bike share data, for example, you'll find that everything is aggregated to a sum. Everything is, kind of high level and fuzzy. Nothing is necessarily detailed or intricate enough to be able to identify an individual or a person. So, you know, I think our goal is to make this data accessible to as many users as possible, so that they can use it for planning and advocacy work. You know, at the same time, we want to strike a balance of protecting people's privacy. So you'll notice that as you zoom in on the fuzzy little ping map, the heat map that we showed you, that the pings disappear when you zoom in too far. They'll disappear from the map. So that's just one small thing that we've done to protect privacy. But yeah, all of the underlying data has all been basically summarized to a level that it's just really talking about larger patterns in the region.
We have a question from an elected official who's curious how this data can help elected officials develop policy and make funding decisions in their work. Josh or Thomas, you want to tackle that?
Well, I think it's useful to be able to, at a glance, sort of get a state of things, right? What is the status of our infrastructure or our funding environment or our outcomes in terms of how many people are walking and biking and what types of people are walking and biking in terms of demographic and socioeconomic factors. Without good information, you can't make good decisions. The nearest term opportunities, I think, are going to be where we can use these visualizations to now quickly see where there's gaps or disparities and focus investment or intention in those places. Because without that data, it's sort of based on assumption or anecdote. And now we have an opportunity to be strategic in a way that we couldn't before.
Okay, we have several questions about data and equity, questions about how can we ensure the data coming into this is equitable, how can people get access to it, and I think like anything, that's a common divide in a lot of fields.
Yeah. So
Josh, go ahead.
Yeah, one of my hopes for this is that because this is a publicly available tool, that you know, anyone would be able to access it. But we are conscious and aware of a digital divide that exists in Kansas City, in our region. And one of the things that I think on the software side that our software team has done is really made sure that these are things that work well on a mobile phone, because people who might not have access to a broadband connection at home, chances are they do have access or some sort of access to a mobile internet connection. And so if they can consume this on their phone and think about how much news and content you consume on your phone from day to day, then it's going to be a little bit more accessible to folks. This is also going to be, I think, you know, our software team has spent a lot of effort making sure that all the maps and data visualizations work with screen readers and are ADA compliant. So that's another thing that we've done to make sure that accessing the data is equitable. And then hopefully, you know, and the story is not 100% finished by any means, but hopefully by putting access and equity questions up front, we're centering that in people's minds as they think about the policy decisions they're making. And, you know, I would say, as somebody who worked on this, I'm totally open to the criticism and feedback that folks might have about how we can expand that conversation, make it more relevant to individual data visualizations throughout this. Good comments in the chat about you know, comparing infrastructure data to population density and poverty information, health information. That's actually something that's pretty quick and easy to do, and would love to do that analysis, just a quick visual overlay. So really good questions and feedback for us there.
And I'm sorry we couldn't get to anywhere near all of the questions we had. Many of you submitted questions with your registration that we weren't able to get to. So going forward, just a few quick things before I turn it over to Liz to wrap us up. like we've explained before, this is really our first version of this project, and we have a lot more that we want to add to it and work on. In terms of the stuff that's here right now, I think we've got enough good stuff here for months and months of really great blog posts where we can dive into specific pieces of data or types of data, some of the things we've learned from this. And so I would encourage you all to keep an eye on our blog for future articles that provide more information about all of this. And then many of you who are with other agencies or government entities or partners, we will probably be coming to you at some point in the future to help us add to both the quantity and the quality of the data in our dashboard. So with that, I think we're at time. So I'm going to turn it back over to Liz Harris to send us home.
Thank you, Josh and mySidewalk for working with us on this. Thank you, Thomas and Rogers, for all of the work that you've put into it. This has been an exciting project to watch happen at the office, and I'm excited to see the fruits of your labor. I would like to thank our sponsors and our funders who have kept us going through this especially challenging year. As Rogers mentioned earlier, the Health Forward Foundation was especially instrumental in getting this dashboard off the ground and running. We also appreciate the support of the Hall Family Foundation, Enterprise Bank, Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Kansas City, mySidewalk, the Shoemaker Foundation, and our members and sponsors. We appreciate all of you for attending today, for joining us for this conversation. Like I mentioned earlier, I'll be following up tomorrow with an email that will include some relevant links. I'll include the link to the dashboard, of course, so that you can explore it on your own time. And we'll follow up with some of those questions from the chat and also from the registration so that we can explore some of those themes a bit more broadly. Thank you all for joining us. I hope that you get a chance to explore that dashboard. And I hope that you get a chance to join our advocacy email list. There have been some questions about how people can support safer streets, complete streets, connected neighborhoods. And I would say that one of the best ways to do it is to help us advocate for those directly to your city leaders. You can text BikeWalkKC to 52886, and that will get you on our advocacy email list, and you will be the first to know as soon as we have an advocacy opportunity to share with you. Thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.